Hello everyone, Smite Chess here, and we've got another game between Leela and Stockfish. Now this is game number 64 in the CCC11 finals, and here Leela was playing white and Stockfish is playing black, and the first couple of moves were e4 e6, d4 d5, knight d2 and knight c6, and this is the end of the book, and we're into a French Tarrasch variation, where black is now playing this knight c6 move which hits out at d4. So Leela plays her first move and responds with knight to f3 to defend the pawn. Black plays knight to f6, attacks e4, and Leela plays e5, attacking the knight, which drops to d7, and white develops again with knight b3, clearing the lines of the bishops. Black plays a5, preparing a4 and trying to squash white. So this would be a very bad move for black to play against white, so white doesn't allow this. They play a4 instead, b6 from Stockfish, and now Leela plays a very interesting move, h4. We've seen this from AlphaZero time and time again, where white or black always seems to launch the pawn and try and get to this h6 square or a6 square, depending on which side of the board they start launching the pawn up. And personally I think I might start playing this in my own games. The idea is that it forces black to play maybe h6, and usually white responds with rook h3 and rook to g3, and this tends to be what the computers seem to do now. But so in the game, Stockfish played bishop b7 to fianchetto the bishop, c3 from Leela, and now she has these great pawns in the centre, all on dark squares and supporting one another. And it really limits the scope of this f8 bishop as well. Queen c8 was played by Stockfish, preparing bishop a6. My guess is as well that black may be preparing to play c5 at some point as well, which would make some sense because I'm not really sure what queen c8 does otherwise. Leela continued with h5 and Stockfish played h6 in the game. Bishop a6 could have been played by black if they wished, but Leela gains an advantage with h6. If bishop takes f1, the king will recapture. If queen a6 check, then white can just retreat the king to g1, and white is actually doing okay. If g takes h6, then white can take with the bishop, and if several captures occur and black castles, white stands better after knight g5 because they're hitting f7 and h7 at the same time. So this would be preferable for white. But in the game, obviously they didn't play bishop a6. h6 is a much more standard move. You'd expect this. White played bishop to e3, and now black does play bishop to a6. And Leela decides her knight's a bit misplaced on b3, so retreats it to c1. Knight d8 as well from black, so maybe preparing c5 as we discussed earlier. And Leela played an interesting move, rook h3, and this is a really nice move. I like this. Her idea is to play rook to g3, and this really inhibits this g7 pawn, and black's going to struggle to develop on the king side if Leela plays this. And again, I was going to say I want to implement this sort of thing in my own game because it really puts black under pressure. If white can somehow gain a bishop on d3 as well, they're doing very well, and this bishop's always got to hang on to this pawn. So we'll see how this develops further. Stockfish played queen to b7 and Leela plays rook to g3, attacking g7. Stockfish plays b5. Now, white could possibly take this pawn with a takes b5, bishop takes, and swap off everything, and play knight to d3 to protect b2. If play continues knight b6, then I think white should play king f1. And if knight c4, bishop c1 is just in time to protect the pawn again. If knight c6, then white can start consolidating with b3, knight b6, and king g1. And you've got to say white has got really good control over the position. You've got good centre pawns, and this rook is dominating this g file at the moment. Maybe white could even prepare to play bishop to a3 and hit this pawn. So, back to the game though. White didn't take on b5, but it was certainly possible. Instead, Leela opted for knight to d3, so rerouting the knight as we discussed. Black played knight c6, Leela goes bishop to e2, b takes a4, and Leela plays queen takes a4. Now black could potentially win a pawn in this position. They could play bishop takes d3, and if bishop takes d3 there's queen takes b2. If white takes the knight on c6, then the rook on a1 will fall. The best move according to Stockfish is king to f1 for white, And if black gets greedy here, with queen takes c3 attacking the bishop, then black loses a knight to bishop to b5. So after king f1 in this variation, queen b7 should be played to protect the knight, and if bishop b5, black can play knight c to b8 to protect the knight on d7. But after bishop c1, c6, bishop to d3, knight b6 attacking the queen, I've run this variation through, and after a series of moves, bishop to a3 takes and queen e7, queen c1, it seems as though white does gain some control. They've just lost a pawn, but as we'll see here, queen to g4, black's forced to play moves like f5 now. After e takes f6, knight takes f6, queen h3 to move the queen away, knight bd7, and knight h4. Suddenly white's got a nice position. They can play moves like knight to g6, and all their pieces are in a very nice attack. If king g8, for instance, knight g6. So if we go straight back to this position, queen takes a4 has just been played. Maybe black thought it wasn't worth taking on b2. The pawn causes a lot of trouble, and white gains a lot of counter-attacking potential if black starts nipping off pawns. So Stockfish plays this very Karpovian, plays rook b8 instead. Leela defends the pawn with bishop to c1, bishop to b5 attacking the queen retreats backwards, Stockfish plays queen b6, king f1 from Leela to put a king to some sort of safety, knight to e7, and Leela plays knight to h4 to stop knight to f5, and black finally hits in the centre with the move c5. And here Leela decides to swap off. She plays knight takes c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5. First, Stockfish plays bishop takes e2 with check, so queen takes e2, and then queen takes c5. So after a series of trades, everyone's got equal material, and we're into the late middle game. So Leela defends her king once again with king g1, just gives it a safety square to king h2, and Stockfish plays queen to b5, so offers a trade of queens. Leela declines and plays queen to d1. Stockfish plays knight c6, attacks the pawn, and finally Leela puts a knight back to f3, more centralised square. They do say knights on the rim are dim, so that's why she played that, and then Stockfish went queen to b6. And Leela's got a few options here. I was thinking queen a4 for Leela. If bishop c5 attacking f2, white can play rook takes g7, and bishop takes f2 is of no consequence because then the king just moves up. If bishop c5, queen f4 attacking the pawn on f7. Queen c7 to defend this pawn, but then white can play knight to d4. Black has a few options here. For instance, if knight takes e5, this actually loses to an amazing move knight takes e6, because the pawn on f7 is pinned. So after knight to d4, knight takes knight has to be played, c takes d4 and bishop to f8, rook to g3 goes backwards, rook c2, and rook takes a5. But white definitely has a better position now. They're a pawn up, and this rook on g3 is actually an amazing piece. It really shuts down this rook on h8 at this very moment. It's not impossible for black to develop this, but they've got very long-term weaknesses on f7 and h6, and black has it all to do. So I would have played queen a4 personally, but in the game Leela played knight to d4 instead. Black played bishop to c5 and bishop to e3 from Leela. Again, the queen can't take on b2 here because then knight takes c6 can be played. After bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, white's just a piece up. So in the game, Stockfish took on d4 with the bishop, bishop takes d4, and then c takes d4. Queen takes b2 here from Stockfish will be met by rook takes g7, king f8 and rook g3. And again, this rook on g3 dominates this rook on h8 because the bishop also attacks h6. And this rook defends h6. After c takes d4, Stockfish played king to f8. Leela attacked with queen to g4, And now we see the dominance of the G file from whites, because if rook to G8 here, then bishop takes H6 just wins a pawn. After queen takes B2, there's bishop takes G7 with check, and the H pawn will just roll down the board. So queen G4 has to be met with rook H7, which is a pitiful move from black. But even so, Leela now just takes on H6 anyway, with bishop takes, which is adding insult to injury. This is because if rook takes H6, there's queen takes G7, and we'll take the rook on the next move. But after bishop takes H6, Stockfish can regain their pawn with queen takes D4. But now bishop takes G7, check. The king has to go to E8, otherwise it loses, and now white can play an amazing move, H6. And now this rook on H7 just looks really silly. It has no squares to go to, and its only meaning in life is to block this H pawn from white, so it's got a pitiful existence. Stockfish continued, rook takes B2, so gaining some material back. Leela decides to trade, queen takes D4, knight takes D4. Threatens to play knight to E2 check, so rook H3 is played, knight to B3, attacking the rook and defending the pawn. Rook A4, knight to D2, and Leela plays G4, so starts rolling these pawns on the board, support this H6 pawn. Knight C4 is played, and now G5. So Leela's just blockaded the dark squares, and this bishop could even jump back to F6 if it wishes now. Play continue, rook B7, rook C3, so maybe white's preparing to sack the rook here, it would make a lot of sense. King E7, king G2, rook went to B8, and finally Leela does play bishop to F6. The king moves, and white just slowly puts their king in an ideal position. Rook B1, king H3, rook G1, king H2, and there's a lot of back and forth here with the same game. We see this a lot in computer games. And here, black has an option. Knight to E4 was an option here, attacking the rook on C3. Play would have probably continued rook F3, rook B1, and rook takes A5. And if king G1, just knight king to F4, white's doing very well. But I'll just run through the rest of the moves because there are 124 moves in total. So black played knight C4, rook A1, king C6, and king H5. So Leela's just got the king up to an ideal position. King C5, and now G6. And F takes G6, king takes, and black defends the rook with rook to B7. But now bishop to G7, and basically black is forced to lose their rook. So rook takes H6, bishop takes, and now white's just a whole rook up. After king D4, there's rook G3, rook to B8, and basically Leela's got a one position here. So white wins the E6 pawn, now just starts launching this E pawn up the board. This is a very easy win. So eventually Leela just grabs more pawns, and we're going to launch another pawn up the board. And I've been told by one of my subscribers actually that the reason why Leela does this is because she's got no endgame table base compared to other engines like Stockfish. So this is why she suffers in the endgame so much and plays these really weird moves. Whereas Stockfish would have probably finished the game by now, Leela is just trying to get to a position that she knows apparently. But if we just fly through, eventually we do get to an endgame where Leela knows what to do. So they swap off rooks, and it's rook and king checkmate. So this is very easy. Just get the king in a box, and it's checkmate. And Leela wins the game against Stockfish once again. So this was a very interesting game. But my favourite move by far was this rook G3. Just dominating this G file, and that seems to have what won the game in the end. Just pushing this H pawn up the board, and eventually in the end game we see that the bishop on G7 and the king get to G6 and win the rook. So let me know what you think of this idea. I wonder if you'll try and implement it in your own games. I definitely want to try this in sort of classical games, so maybe it's worth getting an opening where you can achieve this. It'd be very nice to put your opponents under this pressure. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. A happy new year to you all, and hopefully a great 2020, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers everyone.